Hello, very beautiful community. This is an important chat, and we're going to be together for probably around half an hour. Yesterday, I shared a chat about the dilemma that Zelensky faces, which is very roughly, how do you know, when do you know, under conditions of precarity or uncertainty, at what point it's right to carry on the war, and at what point it's right to take some kind of a peace deal if one is offered to you. And I don't watch my own videos, but I rewatched yesterday's video because there was something I wasn't sure about in how I articulated myself. I rewatched the video and it was close. I took a kind of a 60-40 decision to take it down and retape it. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to tell you, hopefully a little more briefly, everything I said in yesterday's video. Then I'm going to tell you what I didn't get right as a public intellectual in yesterday's video. And then we're going to do the key bulk work of this chat, which is look at a few comments from yesterday that are toxic but enormously revelatory. So we won't beat up on them. We'll use them to understand what it is that we are all troubled by and need to fix in our informational environment. So let's rock and roll first of all with a bit of politics, and then we'll do this sort of, discourse substance. Now, the first thing I said yesterday was that it's very important to be compassionate because we are in a culture where far too many people beat up on the vulnerable. And that's why when I, on the channels, make constructive criticisms, for instance, of the way the rights of some vulnerable groups are being advocated for unconstructively, when I do that, I always elevate the group. I never beat down on the group, I bring it up. Now, for me, that's just a natural expression of personality, even to a degree, a natural expression of masculinity. And it's, of course, also an expression of sort of elementary, baby public intellectual ethics. Far too many people are kicking down on vulnerable folks, and we're normalizing this, and it's disgraceful. And it's kind of an indication of a degradation of standards. We don't want to sound like sort of pious conservative cultural critics, but it's a little bit of a degradation of standards in our culture that should concern us. How does this impact Ukraine? Well, it just impacts Ukraine in the sense that when we look at people who disagree with 95% of you and don't want to support Ukraine, one way of judging whether they're legit or not is to see if they still express compassion for the extraordinarily difficult predicament Ukraine is in, or whether they mobilize Ukraine as a prop in their domestic culture wars and position Ukraine as some kind of a culprit and themselves as an innocent victim of malign foreign forces that are, drawing attention from, their concerns. Look at me, I'm a citizen here. What are you doing? Pay attention to these folks on the other side of the world. Thank you for indulging with this footnote. It's just culturally important. Now, the second thing I said yesterday was that Ukraine had nobody to join, it had nothing to join. That's intended to be a kind of illuminating hyperbolic statement. I don't mean by it that Ukraine doesn't have an alliance to join which would give it security guarantees. As it happens, I don't think it does, but that's not the point I'm making. Now, the reason, by the way, it doesn't is that even if Ukraine got Western security guarantees, the West is currently not in a position to even give itself security guarantees. So these security guarantees wouldn't guarantee much. But what I rather mean is that Ukraine doesn't have a conversation or a strategic vision that it can join, it can align itself with. That's because we're living in a kind of politically futureless society. That's not because we don't have a hopeful future. That's not because we can't constructively talk about the future. It's because we can, but don't. We can, but really struggle to do it. And that's one of the things that scares you a lot, that a lot of the political discourse is just sort of evasive of where we're supposed to be in 10 years, where we're aiming, and what the hell we're going to do about the challenges we face. And very often, this leads to a kind of either catastrophizing or Disneyfyingly positive evasion of the future. So, Europe is currently the collective actor that supports Ukraine, whereas the United States no longer does. But Europe doesn't have a Ukraine strategy. Europe's default tendency is, let's try to bring it about that Ukraine has support for another 6 months, for another 12 months, and then we'll just see what happens. There is no strategy. The United States doesn't just have a lack of strategy, it has a cataclysmic collapse in state capacity and a foreign policy driven not by illusion, as it was under the Bush junior years, but by profound incompetence, people dealing with issues they simply don't understand. Now, of course, the Russian opposition are an actor involved in sort of depoliticized sort of squabbles between themselves, so they're certainly not offering anything interesting strategic. And since the beginning of the war, Ukraine hasn't been able to offer any strategic vision about the future of the European space, or even the future of post-war Ukraine that wins the war by winning the peace. So there's a global lack of strategic vision. And so Ukraine cannot align itself with any kind of platform it can dock with, because it looks to the West, but the West is ceasing to be the West on some important measures. Now we come to the dilemma itself. Zelensky knows that it's uncertain, right, whether at a particular hypothetical moment in time, carrying on the war or agreeing to a peace deal if one is available is better. Moreover, history is contingent. So you might be in a situation where it's 90% of the time right to carry on the war. That's what you do, but the 10% comes and hits you in the face in virtue of historical contingency 4 years later. It can work the other way around too. You can take the wrong option, get the right outcome. You can take the right option, get the wrong outcome. You can't avoid that. And it's important that we sort of blast ourselves out of the Disneyfication of war and actually see this, right? So there is then a further element to this dilemma Zelensky faces, and that's that it would be demobilizing to have an open and straight conversation with the country about this when the country is under existential threat. And the question here is, did this have to be this way? And the answer is probably not. What happened was that Ukraine showed remarkable tenacity in resisting Russian aggression by initially mobilizing around the conception of victory that involved Russian regime change that has ceased to be plausible. But what's happened is that instead of a new conception of victory being developed, a very difficult task for Ukraine, because it's a vulnerable actor dependent on the domestic politics of its sponsor states. So this is a very difficult task, but it didn't happen. There wasn't a second, more realistic conception of victory or sustainable exit from the conflict that developed. And so mobilization has partly been sustained by ongoing references to a conception of victory that is no longer viable, minus a kind of a black swan event in Moscow where the regime topples without us doing anything about it, without us arming Ukraine to a level that would allow it to resist Russia to the point that would destabilize the Putin regime. And because of that, it's probably now too difficult and too genuinely destabilizing to start having an open conversation of under what conditions, right, would we accept a peace deal that was profoundly painful if we thought that carrying on the war would be even more painful than that. Now, here is what I got wrong yesterday as a baby public intellectual. Now, by the way, public intellectual is a neutral term. It's a role. You could be a terrible public intellectual or a good one or a medium quality one. It's not an indication that you're dealing with some kind of exceptional and remarkable voice that's going to save the culture. In the United States, the term might sound pompous. In Europe, it's quite generic. What I got wrong yesterday, which is why I took the 60-40 decision to, on balance, take down and retape the video, is that I overly relied on the previous 10, 20, 30 videos I'd done to fill in a context that I had made implicit but not explicit in the video. And the context is, do you actually think, Vlad, that a deal is currently available to Ukraine, that Ukraine can sustainably take? And what do you think Ukraine should do about the deal that could realistically be available to it in the near future? And my answer here is that there is no deal currently available that Ukraine can reasonably take, because the only thing for now that the Russians will agree to is a deal that will too precariously endanger Ukraine if it agrees to it. It won't immediately asphyxiate Ukraine's sovereignty, but it'll put it at such a risk that it's difficult to see how you don't choose to carry on the war instead, even though you're not carrying the war with a clear trajectory of how you're going to get to a better place. So this is very difficult. It's very tragic. But what I'm going to say, to repeat what I've said in endless videos elsewhere, but I'll say it again now, is that we don't have a deal. We don't have sufficient bridging. And the only way to change that is to put more pressure on the Russians, and Washington won't do that, or to put more pressure on the Ukrainians. And as much as Trump is stepping away from Ukraine, there's certain things he's not currently open to cutting off. And that leaves Zelensky with options, leaves Zelensky with some cards. And the cards are, well, it's viable for us to carry on fighting. And so if the deal you're offering us is so terribly pro-Russian, that's what we're going to do. That's roughly what was implied but not clearly articulated yesterday. And that was a certain kind of failure. It's interesting to be clear about the difference between an intellectual and a public intellectual role. In a philosophy seminar, something like this wouldn't have been a failure, because you don't need to make a clarification of this kind to ward off misunderstanding. You're expecting that the environment itself will take care of it. And the central difference between the philosophy seminar and this conversation is that in this conversation, what comes first for me is not truthfulness, but your relationship with truthfulness. In the philosophy seminar, the relationship with truthfulness of the others in the room is very much secondary, and my relationship with truthfulness is primary. If the other's relationship with truthfulness is good or bad, it is as it is. It's not my job to alter it. In this kind of dialogue, it is my job to move around and shake you around a little bit and invite you and challenge you and provoke you in a way that might add something to your relationship with truthfulness. I don't control what it adds, but it might add something. It might even add something in the way it surprises both you or me. And we say, oh, we didn't see that that could be a nice positive benefit. I didn't plan for it and you didn't anticipate it. And that kind of letting go of control is actually a very central feature of how you have to experience sort of decent public intellectual work. So that's what I got wrong. But now let's turn to the toxic comments, which are going to lead us to a very important lesson about the state of our information environment. So let's have a quick look. Nobody kicks down at the vulnerable like Vlad. And when you have an interesting comment, you can click on the, I'm not sure you can, but probably you can, but I definitely can. You can just click on the name and see what other comments they left in recent times. So the next comment is, I'm honestly appalled a year ago now at how indifferent Vlad is to the prospect of democracies failing in the coming years. And another comment, now 3 months ago, Vlad's next video should be, Ukraine should just surrender because nothing we do matters anyway. Another comment, very sad to see Vlad taking such a defeatist and pro-Putin position. And that is actually quite a benign and excellent comment, which is partly responsive to my fault in the video. And it says, the problem is that there is no peace deal. Nobody suggests peace. I think you're wrong that Russia wants to accept a peace deal. Well, let me insert a quick footnote here. I recommend that epistemically you allow yourself to take the view that Putin has maximalist demands, but that you withhold from the question of whether Putin is open to a deal of any kind or not in the coming months. Because you just don't know enough about the Kremlin to judge, quite frankly. So it's just good epistemic habits to say, I don't know. Now, my analysis of this is that Putin is open to a deal, but is only open to a deal that is the kind of deal that would put Ukraine in a much more toxic position than carrying on the war would. Now, that's to say that Putin is almost close to a deal, but is open to one if he's going to get one that offers him something that begins to approximate the Ukrainian capitulation. It's a bit more nuanced than this, but this is a reasonable cartoon, I think. So it's worth inserting it. The view that Putin is simply not open to any kind of a deal is a misunderstanding of the Kremlin. And here I respond by saying, I don't think there is a peace deal Ukraine can take now. And so it's part of what went wrong for me in the video that I needed to come in and say that. Now, if you'd watched 20 or 30 of my previous videos and you'd listen to this video with excessive attention, you probably would get the, I think that, and I don't need to say it. But I left it too open, and therefore, I think this is an excellent critical comment. But now, let's do an analysis of the toxic comments that we saw without dancing on them at their expense and bashing them up, because that's not what we're about. It's very important that, especially on platforms like mine, which are, for all of the political realism and pessimism, sort of resonantly positive, right? Hopeful, engaged, and about being alive and responsive to the world. It's very important that toxically negative comments on platforms like mine often come from a place of unhappiness. There's a lot of unhappiness out there, and we do not know what is going on for these people who say that Vlad's being pro-Russian, or that Vlad loves to beat up on the vulnerable. We just don't know what's happening. And so it's not healthy for us to beat up on these comments, not just for the sake of these commenters, but also for our own sake. I mean, don't forget, in this sort of interesting debate that sometimes occurs in political theory about whether the ancient Greeks had human rights as a concept, the answer often rightly comes back mostly not, because their idea of what might be their nearest equivalent to our concept of human rights was about putting front and center, not protecting the victim from various kinds of harms, which is what human rights are for us, but actually protecting the potential perpetrator from the psychic and moral harm of doing the bad thing to the vulnerable person. So there's a different centering of agency across this very big cultural gap. But we do, it's just not with human rights, but we do have some conceptions in our culture where we think, well, actually, the reason something is a bad thing to do is because of the way it damages the perpetrator even more than the victim. We do have examples of that. I mean, spanking children might be an example of that, actually, whereby it's something that's nearly impossible to do in a psychically clean way by the parent. And therefore, what's harmful to the child is the psychic state of the parent when they do it rather than the smack. Now, let's agree that we're not going to beat up on these comments, but we're going to be a bit brutal in the way we constructively analyze them, because quite frankly, we're all impacted by the tendencies that these comments express. So let's do this. These comments replace argument with signal detention. I've made a few notes and it'll help us go through more quickly what I want to share with you. They replace argument with signal detection. They don't engage with a claim, but they scan for surface cues. Is there a constellation of words that means defeatist or pro-Putin? Ah, I see it and I latch onto it if it's there. So this isn't reflection, it's factional pattern matching, a kind of a bot-like activity. Is this combination of words there or is it not? And so it replaces the question, what best preserves Ukrainian survival under tragic constraints, the question on this topic, with the question, does this speaker emit the correct pro-Ukrainian signals? And once that substitution happens, substance stops mattering. Now, these comments also very nicely illustrate the tendency in our culture to confuse tragic thought with moral indifference. So I explicitly said in yesterday's video that the current deal Ukraine might get, if it gets anything, would be too pro-Russian. I foregrounded Ukraine's predicament. I foregrounded the need for compassion with Ukraine's predicament. But I am still pro-Russian and indifferent to the vulnerable, because describing complexity and tragic choice violates the activist moral script. It requires affirmation, not analysis. There's a moralization of psychology instead of an assessment of claims. So nobody kicks the vulnerable like Vlad isn't the description of an error, it's an attribution of a vice. And you attribute a vice where, in fact, the vice is most absent. We just talked about this, right? How, there's a certain connection between a warm content that's engaging and toxic response. Now, by the way, let me make another footnote. Perhaps 1 in 5 comments was negative, and maybe 1 in 10 comments or 1 in 20 comments was toxic yesterday, at least in the first couple of hours of the video's live. But the video's like ratio was actually higher than average for the channel. The average channel video like ratio is about 98.8. So 98.8 people click like, 1.2% people click dislike. Yesterday was 99. So you see, this is also an interesting political observation here that's worth making as a footnote, that comments don't necessarily represent how what you're doing is being received every single time. Because particular kinds of content might trigger a very special subgroup to visibly materialize. And that's a huge problem for journalistic institutions, because they get absolutely terrified of a barrage of negative comments, but they don't realize these don't necessarily represent the population and don't even represent the people who've watched their content or read their article. So it's important to make that distinction. Now, there's also treatment of the war as a kind of a gamified moral performance. The relation to the war is a kind of a gamified moral performance. And war becomes a test of an attitude. Optimism equals loyalty, pessimism equals treason. But when you de-Disneyfy yourself, then you then come to see that war also means exhaustion, demobilization risk, impossible trade-offs. These comments illustrate our risk of consumerist engagement with political ideas. So these comments are consumerist because their relation to the war is not participatory and not tragic. It's a mode of consumption. You consume moral clarity. You consume affirmation. You consume the feeling of being on the right side. Consumer culture trains you to expect that moral products come without cost, that loyalty comes without pain, that righteousness comes without tragedy. And so what we're encountering there is not a pro-Ukrainian commitment in a deep sense, it's brand loyalty. Now, these comments also express the psychotic pattern in our discourse, and this is not a term of abuse. People who go through psychosis are incredibly courageous. But there is a psychoanalytic meaning to what a psychotic pattern of thought is, which is that it's thought that has to evict out of it a sense of reality, because a sense of reality is unbearable. And so these comments are psychotic in a technical sense, where you've got this sort of detachment of the symbolic order from reality, and disconfirming information is just not processed, it's treated as hostility. And so when that happens, interpretation just no longer tracks truth, it tracks identity maintenance. Takeaways. Signal reading is replacing understanding far too much in our culture. If you hear the signal, you approve. If you don't, you condemn. Tragic thought triggers anxiety. Compassion is being redefined as denial. So some kind of statement about how Ukraine's not getting enough support, Ukraine's not strong enough, is not permitted, because this fake notion of compassion means there shouldn't be any space for it. But that's denial. This information environment punishes truthfulness. Platforms reward affirmation, not accuracy. Those who speak carefully and exploratorily get accused. Those who simplify get elevated. Over time, this filters out the people you actually most need to hear. I mean, notice how much damage in an evil sense I could do if I didn't have an ethical compass. And I took the Russia is collapsing line every day on the chat channel. I would get hundreds of thousands of views and between 500 and a million views on the main channel. And the special evil component there is I could do that in a way that none of the people who are doing this can, because I could make it sound so plausible that even legitimate country experts, legitimate regional experts would begin to think, well, Vlad might be onto something. Maybe this thing is collapsing every day. So, fortunately, that thought's not available to me. So, if you want the truth, you've got to tolerate discomfort. If you want reality, you've got to resist signal checking. If you want to support Ukraine seriously, you must allow tragic thought. A couple of psychoanalytic remarks on these comments. Ukraine support becomes all good. Any questioning of Ukraine's support, including questioning of Ukraine's strength or questioning of the West's support for Ukraine, becomes an act of hostility that threatens an all-good object. There is anxiety about defeat or abandonment that gets expelled, and claims that are labeled as defeatist or indifferent must be then met with accusations. And there's, of course, a persecutory relationship with thought itself. These are not comments where the people are thinking for themselves. So thought itself feels dangerous. And tragic thought threatens a kind of fantasy of control. And so it must be destroyed by the gamification and moralization of war. And of course, there is no capacity to hold love and loss together. I mean, that's one of the things that's so clear about these reactions. It's an inability to say, I love this, but I also recognize the loss loving this entails. No, I don't want to deal with any loss. It's just love. Well, it's not love without the loss. It's brand affiliation. Because, it leaves no room for a solidarity that includes grief, cost, risk. And real solidarity requires holding incompatible things in mind: courage, exhaustion, resistance, cost, hope, tragedy. I've tortured you enough. Lots of love. And thank you for letting me torture you. And we'll talk very soon.